Welcome, everyone. This is our special report, and it's really going to be a fascinating one because we're going to be talking about the Precariat. What is that? Well, I didn't know either till I read these two fabulous books. One of the books is called The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class, and the other one, A Precariat Charter from Denizens to Citizens. It's a really fascinating concept that I think you're really going to enjoy, especially because I've never even heard of it. So let's find out what it is. And before we do that, we're going to introduce who our guest is. Our guest is coming all the way from across the ocean, the Atlantic in England. His name is Professor Guy Standing. He's Professor of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London in the UK. So let's welcome him from our mother country, Professor Standing. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me.
Fascinating books, really interesting. You know what? And it's so true. I've spoken to so many individuals that fit this mold, but I don't want to give it away. First question I always ask, what got you motivated to write this book?
Well, I've been studying economics for many, many years, and I've seen the growth of insecurity and inequality. And what we've been experiencing is what I've called in the book a global transformation, in which the United States, the UK, and every country in the world is becoming part of a global system. And in that process, the economic strategies that governments have been following, which is called neoliberalism, has created the basis of a new class structure. And it's superimposed on old class structures. But at the top, you've got this plutocracy, which you know a lot about, which is the 0.001% of disgustingly rich people who are off in the stratosphere. Below them, you've got an elite of multimillionaires. Then you've got, a long way below them, you've got a salariat, people who've still got employment security, salaries, pensions, and all that stuff. And the old working class, the old proletariat, if you like, is disappearing in every part of the world. In every part of the world. And it's below that the precariat is growing. And below the precariat, and I'll come to the definition in a second, below the precariat is an underclass. People out in the streets, in every city, in every town that you and I know, we see more and more of these people who are victims, social victims, terrible. But that's not the precariat. The precariat is people who are being habituated to put up with a life of unstable labor, unstable living, which with casualized and temporary work, indirect work, the new thing, cloud labor, and all of this sort of thing. But that's not the most important part. The insecurity of employment contracts and things like that is part of it, but it's not the most important. More important is if you're in the precariat, you don't have any occupational identity, any occupational narrative that you can give to your life. You're not becoming something. And in addition, the people in the precariat find they have to do a hell of a lot of work that doesn't get counted as labor and for which they're not remunerated. A huge amount of work that doesn't show up in our statistics, doesn't show up, but they have to do it. Retraining, networking, applying for more jobs. Some people have to apply for thousands of jobs. Think how much time that takes. Then they find that the retraining that they've done is irrelevant, obsolescent. Then they have to wait around and be on demand, be on call. So they have to use up a lot of time, which creates what I've called the precariatized mind, a feeling you're out of control with your time. You don't know which is the best activity to be doing, right? And that is really a source of stress and insecurity. And in addition, people in the precariat are finding that for the first time ever, we have a huge number of people whose level of education on average is higher than the level of labor they can expect to obtain. That's never happened before. The second part of the definition of the precariat, which everybody in it understands, and I speak to precariat groups all over the world now, is that they have to rely almost entirely on money wages. They don't get access to non-wage benefits like paid holidays, paid medical leave, paid sabbaticals, pensions, anything like that. and they've been losing many of those things that they had. So in addition, because they're relying on money wages, what has been happening in the United States, in Britain, and in most rich countries is that the wages have been falling steadily over the last 30 years. The actual real value of the wages. What they're experiencing is very low wages, very volatile wages, but without any forms of security to back those wages up. So as a result, people in the precariat find that they're always on the edge of unsustainable debt. This is a huge systemic feature that has never existed before. There has always been debt, of course, but the debt that exists now for people in the precariat is systemic. It goes with them all the time. And the final thing about it, the definition, and I've talked to many groups, and this is happening in Scandinavia, Southern Europe, Japan, Korea, all over the world, is that people in the precariat are losing rights, the rights of a citizen. They don't find they have civil rights, for example, because they can't get access to universal justice. They can't afford it, or they face barriers. They don't have cultural rights because they can't belong to a community that would give them a sense of belonging and a sense of developing themselves and a sense of social protection. They're losing social rights because the state, the government, doesn't provide them with rights-based benefits. They have to do all sorts of means testing and behavior testing and dealing with all of those problems. They don't have economic rights because millions of people with qualifications do not have the possibility of practicing what they're qualified to do. And finally, and this is really relevant to your presidential election as it is in other countries, they're losing political rights because they don't see in the political establishment, the political mainstream, politicians and parties that represent them and their insecurities and aspirations. So this combination of circumstances is creating intense insecurity.
Man, that's powerful. You know, it's so amazing how you hit that nail right on the head. I have spoken to many Uber drivers, other people who are doing part-time jobs, and it's like a quilt for them. They have to patch things to be able to make enough money. People who have master's and doctorate degrees making $12 an hour. It is really amazing. Huh?
Or less.
Or less.
You know, many, and the problem is that it's intermittent. It's not every day and every hour they're getting those $12. They can often be facing days with nothing.
Absolutely. I mean, I've even spoken to professors that are working at 5 different universities teaching one class.
Well, last week I was invited to Toronto to speak to the adjuncts, all the academic adjuncts from Canada. And they really got the whole idea of the precariat because that's what they're facing. Many of them are just like you've just said. They're sessionals, they're fractionals. They don't know what courses they're going to be teaching next week, let alone, for over a longer period. And they often have to find time to prepare for many things which might not come up. That's the sort of feeling that they're doing work, not being paid, and they're facing a lot of insecurity. So they can't get mortgages, they can't get insurance policies because they're high-risk situations. So it is general. And if I go to any place in Europe, it's very similar.
That's amazing. I know we want to get to the answer of that. So what are some of the answers to this mess? Because it seems like it's really difficult to solve.
Well, I think the first part of the answer has been taking place in a sense. We will not have a real change in terms of improving the situation for people in the precariat until the precariat has mobilized as such, until there's a common sense of recognition, a common identity. Because millions of people who are in the precariat, like as you said at the beginning, are not aware that they are part of a huge mass of people in similar circumstances. And I think what has happened, particularly since 2011, is with the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, the Indignados in Spain, the various movements in Europe, is there's been a sense of recognition. And that's very important because only when you get that are you going to get a mobilization. And in a sense, you can see this mass support for politicians like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, who would never have got any audience at all 10 years ago, as part of the response to recognizing that huge numbers of us are in the precariat. And a number of Americans have written to me and said, Bernie is the precariat candidate, and as they did with Corbyn. And my answer, Noam Chomsky wrote to me and asked me, what did I think? And I said, well, I think what's happening is these people are primitive rebels. And a primitive rebel is someone who knows what's wrong, but doesn't necessarily know the answer for responding to it. But you've got to have that phase. You've got to have a phase where there's a mass sort of revolt against the old establishment perspectives before you can crystallize a more coherent response. So what I tried to do in the second book was I posed a very interesting question, which was that 2015, which is when I wanted the book to come out, was the 800th anniversary of the founding document of the American Constitution, the British Constitution, and the French and many other countries, which was the Magna Carta, which became the Magna Carta in 1217, but it was issued in 1215. So I asked the question, what would a precariat charter look like in 2015, and how would it differ from what a working class or proletariat charter would have looked like in 1915? All right? And what I've drawn up is a charter of 29 policies that I've been hearing from groups all over the world, in different ways, that I wanted to put them together, which would be a coherent response. And what is very interesting is that it does look very different from what an old social democrat or the Democrats in your country would have been saying 20, 30, 40 years ago. All right? The priorities are different. But essentially what a precariat charter has to try to look like is a reinvention of the Enlightenment values of moving towards more freedom, more equality, and more fraternity, more associational freedom. And to do that, you've got to think about how can the precariat be more represented in all the institutions in our society, including the unions, including occupational associations, including social agencies, and so on. And how can that representation become part of a new politics? I called it a politics of paradise in the first book because I wanted to convey that we are faced with a politics of inferno, a real fear that we're going to have a neo-fascist populism growing, and we need to counter that with a more, not a utopian, but a more progressive view of a politics of paradise. And I think that most of the orientation of the charter I've drawn up, and if you were to draw up a charter or somebody else were to draw up a charter, no doubt it would look different, right? And I always pose the questions when I'm talking to a precariat group somewhere. I say, you would have slightly different priorities. But what I've been finding, and I've addressed over 300 meetings in 35 countries, so it's really is spreading, is there's a broad consensus about what we need to do. And I think it's feasible, it's realistic. And one of the things we've got to realize is that the 20th century income distribution system as such has broken down. We didn't need Thomas Piketty to tell us that, but the system has broken down.
Yeah.
And what we've got to think of is that we cannot allow this grotesque inequality to continue to rise, the chronic insecurity of millions of our fellow citizens, terrifying them every day. We can't allow that to continue. There will be tremendous social strife unless we do something about inequality. And I was very impressed when I was invited to Silicon Valley, to Singularity University, where I thought I'd get a lot of hostility to the ideas. And in fact, of course, they're highly intelligent, those people. They're doing very well themselves. But they're wise enough, many of them, to realize that we've got to have some redistribution. We've got to have people with enough security that they can build and feel in control of their lives. And therefore, things like moving towards a basic income has suddenly moved from when I first started advocating it over 20 years ago, when we were regarded as crazy and, so socialist or something like it, some insult would be thrown at me. Now we're finding that every day more people across the political spectrum are understanding that we've got to move to something like that, because we cannot allow millions of our fellow people to be wallowing in abject poverty and insecurity.
Absolutely. Professor Standing, we ran out of time. Unbelievable conversation. We got to bring you back.
Thanks very much.
I'm going to have to bring you back. Maybe we can even bring Dr. Chomsky back and have both of you discuss this.
That would be wonderful.
Let me make sure everybody knows this. Professor Guy Standing, the 2 books he wrote, fabulous books, highly recommended. The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class, Precariat Charter. Gotta find a way to say that. From Denizens to Citizens. Fabulous reads. You have to read it, because this is going to impact you. You're going to either know somebody who's going through this, or you yourself are going through this. You're part of this dangerous class, as he put it, and I really do believe that. Professor Guy Standing, thank you so much. Is there a website we can go to find you?
Yeah, you can go on my website.
Is it guystanding.com?
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you so much.